Hello and welcome back. Today we are going to be finishing up our lecture on the events that led up to secession. Uh, in the previous lecture, we really talked about the political process starting to fail, right? We had a series of compromises, the Missouri Compromise, the Compromise of 1850, that was, like compromise between the North and the South. And so the slavery question, because of guys like Henry Clay, who gets the nickname the Great Compromiser, the North and the South were able to work out their differences politically. But then we get to Kansas. And by the time we get to Kansas, popular sovereignty, which is led by that cause is led by Stephen Douglas, we see bloody Kansas. And so the political process, we were supposed to vote on it, right? And we had a vote. The vote was certainly not fair. There was violence within that vote, leading up to that vote, and violence after that vote. We start to see that maybe the issue of slavery isn't going to be resolved through the political process. Today, we're going to see kind of a continuation of that. And so one of the first things that we're going to talk about is the caning of Senator Sumner. Caning is just like a beating with a cane, like a walking stick. And so, Senator Sumner is an abolitionist. He believes that slavery is absolutely evil. And he gets on the floor of the Senate and he starts talking about Kansas and how violent Kansas had been, and he blames Stephen Douglas for that. He blames the idea of popular sovereignty for that, and he says some pretty terrible things about a very pro-slavery senator, Senator Butler from South Carolina. And so South Carolina is going to be important here because they're going to be the first state to actually leave the Union. And so when Sumner is saying all of these things about Senator Butler is old and he's not on the floor of the Senate. And so he's not there to defend himself. And so what ends up happening is a family member of his, a congressman, a Representative Preston Brooks, hears about Sumner's speech attacking his family member, and he feels that his sense of like Southern honor has been challenged. And so, there's this, just this kind of sense of gentlemanly behavior in the South that he believes has been violated. And so traditionally you might answer that with a duel. And so, Representative Brooks believes that Senator Sumner is not gentlemanly enough to participate in a duel. So he decides to essentially take justice and revenge into his own hands. Now, Senator Sumner's a big guy. Representative Brooks would never be able to take him in an actual fight. And so in a very ungentlemanly way, Senator Sumner essentially, lays like in waiting, and he hides to try and ambush Senator Sumner. And his first attempt at ambush fails. And eventually he knows that Sumner is going to be in the Senate working. And he sees Sumner in his desk, and Sumner's a big guy in a tiny desk. And so if you've ever seen a big guy in a tiny desk, it's really, there's a struggle to get out. And so he uses this as an opportunity, walks up to Sumner and just cracks him over the head with the cane. Senator Sumner is dazed, falls out of the desk, and Representative Brooks just does not stop beating him, essentially beats him till the cane snaps. And so, and all because he feels like his family and the South have been disrespected. This event, although it is a single act of violence, it does kind of come to symbolize the idea that, these two guys are politicians. It's okay that they have different views. That's what democracy is about. They're supposed to come together and discuss their different views and work out compromise. That's what democracy is about. And the fact that they couldn't do this, that it resulted in violence, and in the violence, Senator Sumner's never going to really recover here. he's going to have mental issues for the rest of his life. He doesn't die. Representative Brooks has to flee. He's going to head down to the South where he becomes a hero. Many Southerners believe that he stood up for Southern honor, and so they're going to be mailing him walking canes. And in the North, Senator Sumner is going to be viewed as this like victim of the violent South that's willing to do anything to promote slavery. And so it becomes a symbol of the idea that politics is failing to come to a compromise. Both sides kind of are going to become heroes in the eyes of their own group of people. And really, again, like I said, is just more evidence that the situation is becoming more and more violent. But we like to pretend like Abraham Lincoln gets elected, and then all of a sudden the South is just out of nowhere like deuces, I'm out. It just doesn't work like that. This tension has been growing for a long time. The political process has been failing for a long time, and it just continues to get more and more violent as we get closer and closer to the Civil War. The next major issue within the debate over slavery is going to be the Supreme Court case, the Dred Scott case. This is probably the worst Supreme Court decision in the history of Supreme Court decisions, and there have been some bad ones. Dred Scott is a slave. He was, he's been sold a couple times. He ends up being bought by a guy by the name of Dr. Emerson. He's a body servant for Dr. Emerson. And so, he's a slave, and just being a slave in general is an awful thing, right? But there are always, gradations of awfulness. And so as far as being a body servant goes, it's less physical labor than a field hand. They tend to live little bit longer. They tend to get to know their masters a little bit better, and so they get to wear nicer clothes and get to travel with their slave owner. And that's what happens with Dred Scott. He's traveling with Dr. Emerson. Dr. Emerson, ends up spending time in northern states, and so he will be brought to Wisconsin, where he spends a couple of years. He's going to be living in Illinois, where he spends a few years, and he kind of goes along. And so I think probably most of you, your ears perked up, and you said, "Oh, he's in Illinois, Wisconsin. Those are free states. What is a slave doing in a free state?" And it could have been relatively easy for Dred Scott to run away once he was in a free state, right? Just, sneak out one night and never come back. And there will be people that will help you escape to, permanent freedom. Dred Scott never does this because Dr. Emerson had promised him his freedom. And essentially he said, look, work for me, and you'll have a job, you'll have food, you'll have nice clothes, you don't have to worry about shelter or whatever. And then when I die, I will free you. And so, Dred Scott, kind of makes the decision to stay. And I'm not saying he made the decision to stay because Dr. Emerson was a great guy. I mean, he owned a slave, right? But Dred Scott just made the decision that, for whatever reason, that this was the best thing for him, whether it was out of fear or whether it was out of some sort of personal benefit for him. I mean, I don't know that we'll ever know why he makes this decision, but he makes the decision. And then Dr. Emerson dies. And when he dies, remember, according to the slave codes, you're in a situation where there are no contracts that can be made with slaves. And so it doesn't matter what the slave owner had promised Dred Scott. If he wanted to free him, he should have freedom before he died, because now that he's died, the property rights go to his surviving wife, and his wife refuses to free Dred Scott, whether she, didn't know or didn't believe Dred Scott that the promise had happened, or whether she knew and just didn't care because she had a different opinion about it than her late husband. I don't have the answer to that. I'm sure you can probably find that information out. But either way, she decides not to free Dred Scott. So Dred Scott sues. And he's going to say, I'm in a free state. I should be free, right? I'm above 3630 in the Missouri Compromise. And I should have my freedom here. And it's going to go all the way up to the Supreme Court. And well, the Supreme Court is going to essentially say no. They're going to say 3630 is not constitutional. Remember, that's from the Missouri Compromise, no slavery above 3630. And they're essentially going to say that the end result is essentially that people are free to have slaves if they want to have slaves. And so the Supreme Court declared that he's property, that the Missouri Compromise is null and void, that there can't be limitations put on the right of people to own slaves. And this is just absolutely devastating for the anti-slavery movement. Now, clearly the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments will void the Dred Scott decision after the Civil War. But the Northerners really freak out here because they had, through the democratic process in the North, said, we don't want slavery here. Now, are there a handful of people in the North that do want slavery? Sure. I mean, that's just the way life is. There's diversity of opinions, no matter what the opinion is. And so, the Supreme Court essentially says doesn't matter if 95% of the North doesn't want slaves. You can't impede the right of the 5% that do. And so it lays the groundwork theoretically, not in actuality, but theoretically, it lays the groundwork for the expansion of slavery into the North. And so you just see now where the South has felt like they're under attack. Right. We've talked about that in previous lectures, that the Northern conductors are coming down and stealing their slaves. They feel like, the North promised to, for California to be a free state, the North promised to enact the fugitive slave laws and actually enforce them, and they didn't. And so the South feels like the North is attacking their way of life. Now the North feels like the South is attacking their way of life by forcing the spread of slavery potentially into, Northern territories and maybe everywhere. And so, you start to see the radicalization of the North as well as the previously how we talked about the radicalization. Then we have something that seems to be unrelated to slavery, but is going to have a huge impact on the South's willingness to leave the Union. And that's going to be the Panic of 1857. Europe had been fighting the Crimean War. While Europe is fighting this war, demand for American goods goes down. And so when the demand for goods goes down, that is going to crush the Northern economy. Now, the Southern economy at this point, really almost all the cotton in the world is being bought out of the South. Egypt will eventually start to become a major producer of cotton. But if you want cotton, at this point, you pretty much have to get it from the South. Some is coming out of other areas of the world, and like I said, Egypt's a big one of them, but they're not able to produce the way the South does. So during the Panic of 1857, Northern industry is going to really suffer, whereas the Southern economy is going to end up being fine. They're not going to suffer at all. This is going to lead the South to believe that their economy is untouchable, right? The North has been talking a long time about you have to have a diversified economy. You've got to be able to produce things and build things. And in the South, they've just said, no, cotton is enough. We can make fortunes off of cotton. That's all we really need. And the Panic of 1857 is going to falsely believed to be the evidence for the Southern strength in their economy. It is false. The Northern economy is better than the Southern economy, even though the Southern economy, has more millionaires in it than the millionaire equivalents, I should say, in it than the North does. The North's economy they make everything up north, and so it is diverse, and in the long run, it is much stronger. But because we have this fluke thing happen where the Northern economy gets hurt because of the decrease in European trade and because of overexpansion and because the railroads really aren't paying off as well as everybody thought they would. The Northern economy is hurt where the Southern economy stays strong. And because of that, the South thinks their system is better. They're going to pay a huge price for this miscalculation during the Civil War, because the North is just going to be able to build way more guns, way more bullets, way more boots. They're going to be able to provide more food because there is farming in the North, but it's food farming, not cotton farming. In the South, it doesn't pay to grow corn; it pays to grow cotton. So they're not growing food and can't eat cotton. And so, the North's going to have more railroads to be able to move supplies and people around, and all that is going to be the difference. The Southern generals are going to be way superior to the Northern generals. They're way smarter. They understand war better. They're going to outsmart the Northern generals over and over and over again, but they're never going to be able to overcome the North's economic might. And not just the fact that they make more guns, bullets, more bread, and have more railroads. They also have, the North, because they have factories. Immigrants are moving to the North to find jobs. So the North has a continuing cycling supply of people that it can use to fight the war, whereas no immigrants move to the South because there's no jobs in the South because of slavery. And so the South has a limited supply of people. So the Panic of 1857 is going to encourage the South to leave the Union because they think they can survive on their own. And that's just devastating because the truth is they can't. So that leads us to the Lincoln-Douglas debates in 1858. So Stephen Douglas is the sitting senator from Illinois. So he's the one that the incumbent. He's been there a while. Lincoln is going to challenge him for that seat. Abraham Lincoln is going to challenge him. And so Lincoln, Stephen Douglas is running as a Democrat. Remember, he is pro-popular sovereignty. Bloody Kansas is being blamed on him, and he's saying people should vote for slavery. Lincoln, during these Lincoln-Douglas debates, while they're campaigning for office, is going to say, no, slavery is immoral. He's going to make he's not going to say he wants to get rid of slavery. He's very careful here. He's going to say he doesn't want it to expand, that it can stay where it is. The states that have it can keep it, and but it should not be allowed to expand out west. Right? He knows that if he says, we've got to get rid of slavery in the South completely, that's probably going to be political suicide for him. So he never comes out and says that, even though deep down he knows that if he stops the expansion of slavery, slavery will eventually die out. But he wants to be able to do that without scaring the South so bad that they leave the Union or do anything crazy or end his political career. So when the two start debating, they agree to a series of 7 debates where each side will have an hour and a half to talk. Now, that kind of thing would never happen today, right? We have presidential debates where we allow candidates to talk for 90 seconds, not 90 minutes. But these things, they would go to the center of the town, they build a big stage, and these guys would just eloquently debate the issues. And what it ultimately ends up being about is the future of slavery. Lincoln will, most famously give his House Divided speech, where he says, house divided against itself cannot stand. And he's talking about slavery. He's essentially saying we can't be half slave, half non-slave. Like that just won't work, and we're seeing the tension between that. It all won't. We either need to be all slave or all free, and that's the only way that our democracy is going to be able to survive the slavery issue. And clearly, he wants us to be all free. But he kind of implies that without just outright saying it. And so, these debates are, because both men are just very, very eloquent, and because Lincoln just proves how smart he is and how well thought out his ideas are. These speeches are gonna become wildly popular throughout the country. The South is beginning to despise Lincoln because of his stance on the immoral aspects of slavery, and his insistence that slavery be contained to where it already is. Now, Douglas, on the other hand, is talking about popular sovereignty. He gives the speech about popular sovereignty in Freeport, and so it becomes known as the Freeport Doctrine, and essentially says that People could keep slavery out of territory if they want. We shouldn't stop it from expanding into the slavery. We should just let people decide whether or not they want it there. And if they want it there, even if Dred Scott says you can't, outlaw it legally, if you don't want it, you can pass local laws and you can do things to discourage it and essentially not, have it in your area if that's what the community wanted. That's kind of a stretch, but you got to understand that Lincoln Douglas really believed that slavery wouldn't expand into the North because it's just not economically viable. You can't really make money off of it. And so people won't do it unless there's an advantage to doing it. And so he really thinks that most of the territories will stay free because of the economic reasons for it. Lincoln essentially just says, no, this is a moral thing. We need to take a stand against it. And we'll essentially make that argument. Now, Stephen Douglas is going to win. He's going to win the Senate seat because he's one of the most powerful senators in the government. And so, people know he's got influence and can do good things for the state of Illinois. And so he gets elected. And so it looks like a loss for Lincoln, but it's really not. It's really not because he becomes a household name. And so everybody knows who he is now. And so without the Lincoln Douglas debates, Lincoln would never be able to win election later on. And the Republican Party is just now solidifying itself. He's giving the party a platform. And that platform is an anti-slavery platform. I think unfortunately, most people today don't understand the, history very well. It's a Republican president, a Republican Congress that end up freeing the slaves and passing the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, giving slaves their freedom and their citizenship and male slaves the right to vote. And so, Lincoln is really kind of solidifying that. As a matter of fact, most African Americans will be members of the Republican Party up until, the recent history where they're almost flip around the time of the Great Depression and become almost exclusively Democrats. So, Lincoln Douglas debates go on. Lincoln loses, but his political career is not over because he made himself a household name, which will ultimately lead to his election. Now, we've been talking about, abolitionists and people who oppose slavery. Well, it's not just abolitionists that oppose slavery. And now you might be thinking, what are you talking about? That's what being an abolitionist means. Well, kind of. Abolitionists, the way we use the term, means that they don't support slavery because of moral reasons and, because they, whether or not they think, African Americans should be completely equal or not. Different abolitionists have different views. William Lloyd Garrison says yes. Other abolitionists say no. But at the end of the day, abolitionists have the general feeling is that they're opposed to the immorality of slavery. Hinton Helper is opposed to slavery, but not for moral reasons. He believes in the superiority of the white race. He is a Southerner whose parents owned slaves, but he sees a glaring flaw in the system of slavery, in that it has made the Southern economy weak. He sees what most Southerners don't, is that there's no diversity in the economy in the South. It is all the major money is being made by cotton. Well, what happens if you have a bad crop? What happens if other countries start growing cotton and mass producing it like Egypt will and the prices drop? What happens when if you do decide to become your own country and your country doesn't produce food or nails or, if you're fighting a war, guns or, finished products. Like you can't eat cotton. You can't build a house out of cotton. You can't do that. And so he essentially says that slavery is economically harmful for the South. And he writes a book called The Impending Crisis. And The Impending Crisis is talking about, hey, look, if you love the South like he loves the South, then we have to have more industry. We can't just rely on making, gigantic fortunes off of cotton and out of slavery. And so, not a, Hinton Helper, not a guy opposing slavery on its morality, but just on its economic harm to the South. And I mean, he's totally wrong. Slavery is clearly immoral, right? So he's wrong there, but he's not wrong on the fact that it is economic slavery is economically hurting the South, and not just poor Southerners, right? Poor Southerners are going to stay poor because of slavery, right? We've talked about that in previous lectures. But it's not just that. It's, rich plantation owners are going to become destitute when, cotton prices drop, or, if they lose a crop to bad weather or whatever, and certainly once the war breaks out and the North starts to blockade the South, you can't eat cotton. So, it's, it behooves you to use some of that land to at least grow food, and Helper points all of that out. Now, this leads us to the next major event that's going to happen leading into the Civil War, and that's going to be Harper's Ferry. Harper's Ferry, again, more evidence that the political system is failing and that violence is becoming more and more of the norm. So the Harper's Ferry is going to be organized by John Brown here. John Brown is a radical abolitionist. I mean, absolutely radical. And not just because, like, William Lloyd Garrison was radical because he said whites and blacks are equal. Slavery should be destroyed, and that if we have to if we essentially have to start over with the new Constitution, that's what we need to do to make sure whites and blacks are equal. At the time, that's considered radical. John Brown believes all those same things, but he believes that the only way that we can, get to end slavery is through violence. And so, he's the one that went to Kansas during Bloody Kansas and was like hacking people up with knives. So he's killed to try and end slavery. A white guy that's willing to kill people to end slavery. And so he's going to come up with a plan to try and start a slave rebellion in the South. And, John Brown is he's had all kinds of failed businesses. He's not a very smart guy, but he is a true believer. And so he goes to the North and to rich men in the North that are abolitionists, and he asks for money to buy weapons to head down to the South and essentially start a slave rebellion and arm slaves in the South, essentially to rise up and to take over, and then flee into the mountains to kind of start a free colony of slaves. And so he is going to take those guns, arm his followers, head to Harper's Ferry, which is there's an arsenal at Harper's Ferry. He wants to take over that arsenal and then use all the guns that are in the arsenal to supply them to slaves to start his rebellion. He is initially going to be successful. He's going to be able to take over the arsenal, but the South has been prepared for this because of Nat Turner's rebellion. The South has had time to plan for how to address these things. And so Robert E. Lee is going to be sent, they're going to be able to initially contain John Brown at Harper's Ferry. And so when he takes over the arsenal, puts out the call for, the slaves to come get guns and help fight, plantations go on lockdown. And they're able to contain John Brown at Harper's Ferry, essentially surround him. And then the military comes in, led by Robert E. Lee, who's going to be the famous Southern general later. And they're able to squash John Brown and his followers relatively quickly. He is going to be hung with 6 of his followers for trying to start a rebellion. This is going to further radicalize the South and the North. The South is radicalized because this is a Northerner who just invaded the South violently to try and overthrow their government. And so the South is like, look, the North just won't leave us alone. They won't make good on their promises to enforce the fugitive slave law. We can't work with the North anymore. Not only are they not enforcing the fugitive slave law, they're literally trying to overthrow our governments in the South. In the North, the South just killed a white man. And, it's like, man, now the South is killing Northerners. They just attacked Charles Sumner. And so Senator Sumner. And so, I mean, the North is starting to believe, that the South are just these violent, people that are willing to kill to spread slavery. And so both sides are becoming even more radicalized. So here's an artist's rendition of John Brown, kind of romanticized version. The North definitely romanticizes John Brown. Good for him. I mean, he put his money where his mouth was. He opposed slavery and he was willing to fight to try and end it. And I guess there's something admirable in that. I mean, I'm not I think violence is bad, just all around bad. But hey, he's trying to end slavery, and good for him. But he was kind of an idiot. It was not the greatest plan in the world, and so paintings like this are kind of hero worship of a guy that's like little sketch. But anyway, what really kind of does happen afterwards, though, is when he goes to be hung, he actually slides a note out to the guard to be read later, and essentially he predicts what's about to happen. He essentially says, like, look, I thought I could start a small rebellion that would be, there'd be violence, people would die, but a relatively few number of people would die. The system in the South, once the slaves got their hands on some guns, they wouldn't be able to be enslaved again, and we would end the system of slavery that way, and not that many people would have to die. Now, because the military got used, and the Northerners are upset by this, the United States military got used to put down this rebellion to, keep slavery in place. He essentially says, man, this is going to end in massive bloodshed. He essentially calls the Civil War and says this is probably going to have to happen. It's going to be massive amounts of blood will have to be shed to end slavery. And he's not wrong, right? I, John Brown, am now quite certain that the sins of this guilty land can never be purged away but with blood. I had, as I now think, vainly flattered myself that without very much bloodshed it might be done. He really thought that it was his rebellion would work and not that many people would die. And he's like, nope, we're going to have to really fight this one out. And lots of people are going to die as a result. So that leads us to the last straw, the last thing that happens before the Civil War. And that's going to be the election of 1860. And spoiler alert, the election of Abraham Lincoln. Democrats are going to split the ticket. That means they're going to run more than one candidate, which means that essentially half the Democrats are going to vote for one guy, half are going to vote for another, and then all the Republicans are going to vote for their guy, which means that the Republican Party has a serious advantage here. So the Democrats, how do they split their ticket? Well, we're going to see actually kind of three Democrats. So they split it kind of three ways, although one guy doesn't really factor in much. We're going to see John C. Breckinridge, who's a Southern Democrat. John C. Breckinridge is, he's from Kentucky. He's going to talk about, protecting slavery. He wants federal protections for slavery. So he wants Congress to guarantee that slavery is protected and should be expanded into the territories. So he's an expansionist for slavery. So this is the South's guy. Now, he's still talking about staying in the Union, right? So he's not talking about leaving the Union yet. But when the South does leave the Union, he will go with them. But he just, as a president, he says, elect me. I will make sure slavery stays in the South and is allowed to expand out west. Then you have the Northern Democrats. Northern Democrats are going to be represented by Stephen Douglas. Stephen Douglas will come in second in this election. Breckinridge comes in third. And so Douglas's view, as we talked about, is Freeport Doctrine, it's popular sovereignty. He says, let everybody vote. And so if you're a Democrat from the South, you might like Stephen Douglas, but you're going to vote for Breckinridge because Breckinridge is saying, no, we're just going to let you have slavery in the West. Stephen Douglas, little less appealing because, if you let people vote, you might get slavery to expand, you might not. So the Southern Democrats are going to go for John C. Breckinridge. Northern Democrats that, right, maybe don't want the expansion of slavery, but they don't want to see a fight with the South. they're going to vote for Stephen Douglas. So Northern Democrats are going to kind of break for Stephen Douglas. The problem is they're just for Douglas, not for us, but the problem for Douglas is there's just not going to be enough Northern Democrats for him to make much of a difference. Then you're going to see kind of the third Democrat, even though this is not he's not technically a Democrat, is the Constitutional Union Party led by John Bell. And so he is a pro-slavery guy, but he's going to be, as far as he's willing to say we got to protect slavery where it's at, but he's willing to give up slavery in the territories if it means keeping the Union together. And so he's even more kind of like he's more compromising than Breckinridge. And so, eventually when the South leaves the Union, he will leave with them. But, he's really going to, when he's campaigning, he's really campaigning on, hey, he's willing to give up the expansion of slavery to keep the Union together. And then you've got Lincoln. Lincoln gets nominated in the Republican Party. There's a guy by the name of William Seward. We'll talk later about. He's the guy that purchases Alaska. He becomes Lincoln's best friend. He's the Lincoln's Secretary of State and his closest advisor. Those two are running both to be nominated by the Republican Party. The Republican Party will nominate Lincoln because Lincoln is less anti-slavery than William Seward. Seward is like, nope, we got to end it, completely get rid of slavery, even in the South. Lincoln is like, well, even though Lincoln, all the indications are Lincoln wants to end slavery completely everywhere, he knows that you can't get elected that way. And so what he says is, let's stop the expansion of the territories, but let the South keep their slaves where they have them now, and then eventually it will die out. And he knows that if you take any harder of a position than that, then you can't get elected. And so the Republican Party knows it too, and so they elect Lincoln. Lincoln will win. He will win because he's going to unite the North, and the South will be divided essentially between, Douglas, Breckinridge, and Bell. So what's he want? Almost all of this is going to really upset the South. One, exclude slavery from the territories. Clearly, the South doesn't like that. It's going to upset the South. Two, he wants to adopt a protective tariff. The Panic of 1857 has hurt the Northern industry. And so he wants to put a tariff to make more Americans buy American, which makes prices go up. The North doesn't mind that because it spurs business in the North. Guess who hates that? The South, who doesn't make anything. They've been claiming for the longest time. Remember the tariff of abominations from a previous lecture, that anytime you place a tariff on goods, that just means prices go up. That always hurts the South because the South doesn't make stuff, so they don't benefit from it. So this upsets the Southern Democrats. And then he wants to enact a free homestead law. So he unites the West behind the Republican Party because he's talking about giving free land to people who move out West. So this is really going to unite a lot of the Westerners towards the Republican Party because they're going to help settle the West. And then four, he wants to support railroad building with federal money. This is going to upset the South too, because it's going to be money from the federal government. So it's going to be money from the southern states' taxes as well that gets spent on railroads that primarily benefit the North. Although the South will benefit from some railroads, the vast majority of railroads are going to be in the North. So that's going to upset the South as well. So the election happens. Lincoln wins every state in the North with the exception of New Jersey. You're going to see Breckinridge wins most of the South, with the exception of the border states that Bell wins. And you're going to see Douglas, who wins a lot of actual votes. You're going to see him win the second most number of votes, who actually wins very few electoral college votes. So, boom. Breckinridge wins the lower South. And when this happens, when Lincoln takes over the South because of the Republican Party platform and all of the other things that have happened up until this point, are going to make them want to leave the Union. It's not just Lincoln. They hate Lincoln, but the common story is that it's Lincoln gets elected. It's not just Lincoln. It's they believe that the North won't work with them anymore. And they're attacking their way of life because of the fact the North doesn't enforce the fugitive slave law, the fact that they're placing tariffs on goods that are hurting the South, the fact that John Brown has infiltrated the South and caused violence and insurrection in the South, the fact that Kansas voted to be a slave state and the free portion of Kansas set up their own government. And so they think the North won't allow the elections to be fair. And then, boom, Lincoln gets elected and he says no more slavery in the territories, and that's the final straw that's going to essentially going to push the South out of the Union. South Carolina will be the first to go, and then we'll just see a series of states follow in turn. When that happens, Lincoln just can't accept that, and so that will be the start of the Civil War. All right. So that concludes our lecture for today. Thank you very much. I appreciate your time, and I will see you again shortly.